ACCEDE is before Juan Carlos and Dario tell you how it looked in some of the trials. Great. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Does this work?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So first of all, I know this is the last talk of the day, so I appreciate everybody hanging in there. My name is Kevin Forney. I'm with Valent. I'm a product development manager responsible for our PGR product line. And so I'm really excited today to talk about a new product that we just recently introduced, a new plant growth regulator product called ACCEDE. So just a little bit about ACCEDE, about the mode of action to begin with. The active ingredient in ACCEDE is a naturally occurring amino acid. And the way that it works, it actually acts as a precursor to ethylene in the plant. So it's absorbed by the plant, and then following the biological pathways, it's converted to ethylene or endogenous ethylene in the plant. And so I think probably many of you are familiar with ethylene. It's one of the 5 major plant hormone that's involved in a number of different plant processes, including fruit abscission, fruit maturity, red fruit coloration in certain crops. So it's pretty broad in terms of some of the things that ethylene is involved in. So the initial registration that we have on ACCEDE is for fruit thinning in both apples as well as peach and nectarine. So some of you that are involved in apple production or know of apple production know that there are a number of chemical thinners currently available for use in apple. The one thing that makes ACCEDE kind of unique from most of the other apple thinners is it can be used at a late post-bloom timing. Most of the other chemical apple thinners need to be applied much earlier than that. And so for that reason, we do recommend application anywhere from 15 to 20 millimeter king fruit diameter. But what we're going to talk mainly about today is our peach and nectarine label. This product is really unique and because it is really the first of its kind chemical fruit thinner that's labeled for use in stone fruit. As far as the application timing of ACCEDE in peach and nectarine, we're at the bloom timing. So that application can go out as early as pink bud and up to and including petal fall. A little bit about the active ingredient itself. The active ingredient is aminocyclopropane carboxylic acid, or more easily referred to as ACC. And as I mentioned, it acts as an ethylene promoter in the plant. The ACCEDE LC formulation it's a 10% liquid formulation, so it contains 15 ounces of AI per gallon. As mentioned, it is currently labeled on apple as well as in peach and nectarine. And then for the chemist in the room, that's the chemical structure. Just a little bit about the mode of action. So we actually have 2 products at Valent that are involved in ethylene synthesis. One is called Retain. Some of you may be familiar with it. It contains the active ingredient AVG. It is actually an ethylene inhibitor. And the way that it works is it actually blocks the production of ACC in the plant. Retain is currently labeled on a pretty broad range of tree nuts and tree fruit for improving fruit set, delaying harvest for harvest management. But the product that we're going to talk about today is ACCEDE. So it's kind of the polar opposite of Retain, if you will, where Retain or AVG is blocking ACC. ACCEDE is actually promoting ethylene through the production of ethylene through ACC. And then the diagram on the right is just more of a detailed description of what's going on as far as production of ACC. And you can see, so once ACC is applied to the plant, it's the ACC oxidase in the plant converts that over to ethylene. So now a little more just about specifically uses in peach and nectarine. First of all, as far as the key benefits for this product in peach and nectarine, of course, first and foremost, it does allow for less labor through reduction in hand thinning times. So that's really is the main benefit of this product. Although I will say that in a lot of our trials, it's consistently shown an increase in fruit size compared to just hand thinning alone. And we'll talk a little more about that and why that probably is. Another potential benefit is that especially in heavy setting trees, you can often get some limb breakage, and of course by managing your crop load, this could reduce limb breakage. And then lastly, we have seen in a number of our trials that we can see an advancement in maturity with this product. Now, it's likely due to fruit load management more than anything else. With that application going out at bloom, it's unlikely that we're seeing that increase or that advancement in maturity due to the ethylene itself. So it's likely more of a crop load management that's actually shown us that advancement in maturity. And we'll talk a little more about that as well. So fruit size, like I said, consistently in our trials, we have seen an increase in fruit size compared to hand thinning alone. The reason we think that this is occurring is because these treatments are going out at a much earlier stage of growth compared to hand thinning. And so because there's less competition between those fruitlets earlier on, you've got more of that tree's energy going into sizing up fruit. So this is a couple of photos taken from one of our commercial trials looking at crop load. This was just taken immediately prior to hand thinning with the untreated control on the left and the ACCEDE treatment on the right. And you can see with the ACCEDE treatment, that's showing about a 50% reduction in hand thinning versus the untreated control. So one thing I should mention is what our objective has always been in our trials is that we're not looking to completely replace hand thinning. We're really looking to significantly reduce the amount of time needed to hand thin. What we feel, and we've always kind of targeted that 30 to 60% reduction in fruit set, and the thought is that that will not only give us a significant reduction in hand thinning requirements, but it also still gives you enough fruit left on the tree to kind of fine-tune your crop load. So if we go back to that previous picture, you can see on the right-hand side, very nice, like I said, about 50% reduction, but you can see that, yeah, it still could use a little bit of hand thinning just to fine-tune it. One of the questions that I often get about ACCEDE is how does it compare to Ethifon? And so Ethifon, as I think most of you probably know, is another ethylene-generating compound. So really the main difference between these two compounds is the way that they produce ethylene. So as I mentioned, with ACCEDE, it's a biochemical reaction. It's taken into the plant, and following the plant's natural biological pathways, ethylene is produced. For Ethifon, and the way that it produces Ethifon is more of a physiochemical reaction. So what's going on is it's physically producing ethylene, and it's mainly due to changes in pH and changes in temperature. So this graph that we're seeing here was a trial that had been done a couple of years ago looking at ethylene production following applications at two different temperatures, at 77 degrees and at 95 degrees on the right. So we're looking at the ethylene production here from ACCEDE, which is the green bar, compared to that to Ethifon, which is the gray bar. And you can see that the ethylene response with ACCEDE was pretty consistent across both of the temperatures. However, you can also see that on the Ethifon, there was a pretty good spike of ethylene being generated as the temperature increased. So that can be problematic, especially if you're using Ethifon under high temperature conditions where you can run into an overthinning situation or even potentially some injury because of that spike of ethylene. One of the other main differences between ACCEDE and Ethifon is that Ethifon, because it is formulated at an extremely low pH, typically it's like around 2 or 3 is what the formulation pH is, that can cause some injury, especially to shoots, young shoots, which can result in gummosis, which is showing the picture on the right. And so, in fact, that's one of the main reasons that Ethifon is not widely used on stone fruit, because of this potential for gummosis or injury. ACCEDE, on the other hand, in the multiple years of testing ACCEDE, I've never seen nor had any reports of Exceed causing gummosis in stone fruit. So that is a big benefit of Exceed over that of Ethifon. Getting into the label, the label for peach and nectarine allows 1 to 2 applications at a rate range of 34 to 69 fluid ounces per acre, and that equates to 300 to 600 parts per million. As far as the timing, again, we're targeting anywhere from pink bud up to petal fall. Now, Exceed is not currently approved for post-bloom applications, so that the last window of opportunity that we have for applications currently is at petal fall. We also highly recommend the use of a good, high-quality non-ionic surfactant when using Exceed. Typically, whatever a labeled rate is, that's generally going to be anywhere from 0.05% by volume to 0.1% by volume. And we'll talk a little more about that and why that's important. I'll show some data that shows that we do see a nice response with the use of a non-ionic surfactant. So this is just some visual effects of Exceed. One of the things that you'll notice when you apply Exceed oftentimes is you'll see almost soon or immediately after the application, say within a day, possibly up to 2 days, we start seeing some petal drop. But it isn't actually until you're probably 4 or 5 days out that we start actually seeing the fruit thinning response. So I mentioned that because, as I mentioned, the label does allow up to split application. If you are going with a split application, of course, that first application should go out at that early bloom timing. Then potentially it would give you enough time to assess that treatment before making a decision on whether or not a second application is needed. In theory, but as you well know, oftentimes our bloom period can be pretty short. So if you're putting that application out, we may be on, at or beyond petal fall within a couple of days, and honestly, that's just not going to be enough time to really fully assess the treatment effect. So for that reason, we typically recommend a single application, and that application can go out anywhere, like I said, up to and including petal fall. One of the other things is we found that applications going out prior to pink bud, so say at green tip, are just simply not effective from a fruit thinning standpoint. One of the things that we've seen in a number of our trials is that there tends to be later bloom development in the upper canopy of the tree versus the lower canopy of the tree. So with that in mind, if you're putting your application out, especially at that pink bud timing, you want to make sure that you're at pink bud, at least at pink bud in the upper portion of that canopy. If you're using the lower canopy to kind of determine your pink bud timing, there's a good chance that the tree is not going to be quite at pink bud in the upper part of that canopy. And once again, we just don't see a real good effect from a thinning standpoint if the applications go out any time before pink bud. So a little bit about some of our field trial results on peach and nectarine. So over the last couple of years, we've conducted some large-scale commercial type trials on peaches and nectarine across the U.S. and the major peach and nectarine growing regions. Now, these trials, they are commercial trials, so they're large size, typically anywhere from 2.5 to 5 acres in size. Over the 2-year period, we've now conducted over 180 of these large-scale commercial trials. They've all gone out with commercial air blast equipment. And in those 2 years, across those 180-plus trials, we've tested Exceed now on about 75 or 80 different peach varieties and 25 to 30 different nectarine varieties in these studies. So this is just a summary looking at percent reduction in fruit set over these 2-year studies on peaches alone. So you can see the bars are showing percent reduction. Now I've highlighted that area from 30 to 60, so getting back to that earlier comment I made, that's kind of what we're targeting in terms of our fruit load reduction. And at the bottom in the x-axis, you can see the individual varieties that were tested in these trials. So maybe a little hard to see, but you might notice that there, in some of the varieties, there's a number in parentheses behind that. So that simply means that there were either 2 or 3 or 4 trials that included that variety, and then that percentage is based on an average of those 2 or 3 or 4 trials. So if you look at this and compare it to that 30 to 60% target that we're really shooting for, you can see we had quite a few trials where we were below that 30%. So I guess that could probably be considered under thin. And then we also had a handful of trials that were above that 60%. But on average, across all of the trials, we were seeing on average about a 40% reduction in fruit set in these trials. I will mention that if you are looking at ACCEDE, or if you're using ACCEDE for the first time, and it's on a variety that you've not tested, a couple of things. One is make sure that you talk to your Valent representative, because this is just our commercial data. We've been testing this product now for several years, not only in large-scale trials, but in small plot trials. And so we do have information on quite a few varieties, and it's quite possible that if there's a variety that you're interested in looking at, we may have already tested it in some of our trials. And then secondly, we have a rate range, as you saw on that previous slide. If you're using this product for the first time, probably want to stay on the lower end until you've at least had a chance to look at it, maybe not treat your entire orchard, just to get a feel for how this product is going to perform under your varieties and under your conditions. So taking that commercial data from 2 years of studies, what I did is I went through and I started kind of separating out the data, looking at it, looking at a number of different things. One is I wanted to look at to see if there was any difference in fruit thinning response based on the application timing. So I took all of the trials that had an early bloom timing, so that would have been anywhere from pink bud to 30% open, saw what the average fruit set reduction was, and then again with any of the trials that were applied at mid bloom, so that would have been anywhere from 35 to 65% open bloom, and then lastly looking at our late bloom application, so that would have been anywhere from 70% open bloom to petal fall. And you can see that there was a slight numerical reduction in that mid-bloom application versus the early bloom but late bloom, but generally speaking, not a significant effect in terms of the thinning response based on application timing in these trials. So what that tells me is that if you were planning on, say, an earlier application and for whatever reason, say, weather wasn't going to be cooperative and you wanted to delay your application to that more of that late bloom timing, you could do so without having any adverse or any problems in terms of thinning response. One of the other things I looked at was looking at thinning response with ACCEDE based on maturity type. So I took all of the varieties that were early season varieties, and across these 2 years of studies, we had 55 of those varieties that were considered early season varieties, also mid-season varieties and late season varieties. And you can see, once again, there was a slight reduction with the late season varieties compared to the early season and mid-season, but overall, very, very little difference in terms of thinning response based on maturity type. So this is just kind of a snapshot of what our general overall assessments have looked like in these large-scale commercial trials. On the left-hand side is looking at percent fruit set reduction. So if you look at it, and this is across all of our large-scale trials on both peach and nectarine, on average, we saw a reduction of about 37% across all of our large-scale peach and nectarine trials. We also, in a number of these trials, were able to go in and assess hand thinning times with the ACCEDE treatment versus the untreated. On average, we saw about a 45% reduction in hand thinning times where ACCEDE was used compared to the untreated control. And then, as I mentioned, we have consistently seen an increase in fruit size with the use of ACCEDE over that of hand thinning alone. On average, in these large-scale trials, we're seeing about an 8.6% increase in fruit size. where ACCEDE was used. So this is a trial. One of the things I mentioned is that we have seen in some of our trials we're advancing maturity with ACCEDE, and I think again this is probably more due to a fruit load management standpoint. This was a trial that was conducted at North Carolina State University this last year, where we looked at percent of the fruit harvested across 3 different harvest dates, and you can see that we kind of had a shift for more fruit being harvested at that first timing versus the later timing. And the reason that's important, of course, with that earlier harvest, that earlier fruit, that tends to be more valuable than the fruit harvested later on. But also potentially what it could mean is that if you were in normally a 3-pick scenario, potentially you could even maybe condense that into a 2-pick scenario. This is another study. This one was out in California on nectarine, the variety August Lion. The application, the ACCEDE was applied at 450 parts per million at 90% bloom. And so at the top left-hand side, you can see just the hand thinning. The fruit sample was collected from just hand thinning alone. On average, we saw an average fruit diameter of 61.3 millimeter in the hand thinning only. Where we used ACCEDE, we were able to increase the average fruit size to 67.6 millimeters. So a little over a 10% increase in fruit size versus hand thinning alone. One of the things that we also saw was that there tended to be more red color where we used ACCEDE. And again, I think that gets back to more fruit load management than anything. And so we're advancing that maturity a little. This is a trial that was conducted this last year that Dr. Melgar was involved in, looking at percent fruit set on 2 different varieties, early August Prince and Harvester. The treatments that we looked at, this was actually looking at the effect of surfactant. So on the left-hand side is the untreated control, and then the middle bar is ACCEDE at 600 parts per million, applied at the standard 0.05% by volume non-ionic surfactant. And then we increased the surfactant to 12 fluid ounces or 0.1% by volume on the bar on the right. And you can see across both varieties, we did see a significant increase in thinning response where we doubled up the rate of NIS. So reason for that is that it's important that we get good coverage with ACCEDE. What we typically recommend is 100 gallons per acre spray volume. And then also, especially if this application is not being applied, is being applied under earlier or quicker drying times, we first of all, we suggest that the application go out so in under low drying conditions, so early morning, late night. If you're unable to do that, increasing the surfactant rate would probably not be a bad idea.
Why was that? Why do you need the drying rate?
It allows. The question was why do we want to make this application under low drying conditions? Just allow more time for that product to move into the plant. If it's too dry, we get a lot of evaporation, and so we don't get the amount of product into the plant that we're really looking for. This was another surfactant study that we did out in California, looking at ACCEDE without a surfactant versus ACCEDE with a high-quality NIS. In this case, it was Regulate at 0.05%, and then also looking at ACCEDE with an organosilicone. In this particular situation, it was Silwet L77, also at 0.5%. So you can see that we did get a numerical response where surfactant wasn't used, but statistically it didn't separate out from the untreated control. Where we saw our best response was with the non-ionic surfactant, even better than the organosilicone. So again, our recommendation with ACCEDE is to use a good non-ionic surfactant when you're applying ACCEDE. And then lastly, just go through some of our best practice recommendations when using ACCEDE. One is that the product should be stored between 45 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, if the product has been opened, we do recommend that the product not be stored below 55 degrees. We have seen a very nice rate response in our trials with ACCEDE, and so for that reason, the rate of ACCEDE will depend on the amount of thinning that you're targeting. And again, if you're looking or trying ACCEDE for the first time, do recommend that you stay towards the lower end of that until you kind of got a better impression of how it's gonna perform under your situations. Again, talking about the importance of water coverage, so we do recommend 100 gallon per acre as a standard spray volume, and then also making applications under low drying conditions. Now, we have seen instances of overthinning when ACCEDE was used around the time of frost event, so plus or minus a couple of days of a frost event. So what we suggest is that if frost is expected or frost has occurred before the application has gone out, you want to evaluate the damage that may have been caused by frost and determine whether or not an ACCEDE application is still necessary. As with most plant growth regulator products, we do recommend that the spray solution is kind of at a neutral to slightly acidic, so kind of targeting that 5 to 7 pH in your spray tank. Also, you do not want to apply ACCEDE to stressed trees. Ethylene is a stress hormone, and so when you've got a tree that's under any type of stress, it's already producing endogenous ethylene in the plant, and so the addition of ACCEDE will just add more ethylene to that plant, and you can get into an overthin situation where if ACCEDE was applied to a stressed tree. As far as the rain fastness, ACCEDE has a rain fastness of 8 hours. So because these applications are going out at a bloom timing, there's certainly a possibility that they could go out in combination with a fungicide application. We don't have the ability to test every single fungicide or fungicide combination. We did identify a few fungicides that we felt were pretty widely used. We included Quash, Luna Sensation, and Coside 3000, and did some compatibility testing. What we found was that there was no issues or incompatibilities with either Quash or Luna Sensation. We did see an actual color change where we combined Coside 3000 with ACCEDE, but there was no other physical difference. It wasn't a physical incompatibility, but it was a color response, so it's worthwhile to note. And so what I would suggest is that if you are planning to tank mix ACCEDE, before you mix up a whole sprayer load, I would probably do a quick and easy jar test just to make sure that there aren't any issues with physical incompatibilities. I wouldn't anticipate any, but it's always better to be safe than sorry. And so just in closing, a couple of key points of take-home messages is that ACCEDE does deliver effective crop load management, and that, of course, allows for less labor for hand thinning. And then, as I said, what we've consistently seen in our trials is a nice increase in fruit size as well versus hand thinning alone. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions, or Dr. Melgar, if you want to open it up to. Okay, yes.
Were there any studies done on the age of the tree, how it affects the thinning capability?
Yeah, we started looking. The question was, the age of the tree and what we've seen. We started looking at that and going through some of the commercial data and trying to really identify what the actual age was. Too far right now, I can't say for sure that we're seeing effect based on tree age. So it doesn't appear, but we just started looking at that, so it's hard to really say for sure.
Should a grower consider changing the rate or doing anything different if this is applied like before pruning or after pruning? Or I guess all you're tests, were they done after pruning,
They were done prior to pruning for the most part.
prior to pruning?
Right.
Okay.
And that's a good question. The question was, regarding pruning before or after the application of ACCEDE. So again, getting kind of into that comment I made about stress, even pruning is going to cause some stress to the tree. And with that stress, that tree is naturally producing ethylene. So I would suspect that if you apply ACCEDE around the time or close to the time that you've thinned, you might see an additional fruit thinning response just because of the additional ethylene being produced in the tree.
Any other questions? All right, thank you, Kevin.
Let's transition and hear what Juan Carlos has to say about his work. Where are we at? This is yours. All right.
All right. Well, I'm going to show some of the data that we've got in a couple of ACCEDE trials that we've done in the last 2 years here in South Carolina. Oh, there in South Carolina. We did one in 2021 and another trial in 2022. And those were all, of course, following the guidelines and recommendations that Valen was telling us. In the experiment in 2021, we used 4 cultivars. This was done at 2 farms, at Titan Farms and at Big Smile or Yons. So we used 2 cultivars, Summer Prince and Carol King were at Titan Farms, and June Prince and Scarlet Prince. 4 cultivars, sorry, at the Yons' farm. And the first 2 trees were mature, big trees, probably 10, 11 years old, because some of them were pulled out shortly after. The June Prince and Scarlet Prince were small trees. Actually, these ones that we're looking at here, so they were much smaller in size, and this has some implications on the thinning times that you're going to see later. And then we had 3 treatments. The first year, in 2021, we only tested 1 rate, 300 ppm. And so we have a control with no ACCEDE. One treatment was 1 single application at 300 ppm, and the other one was 2 applications at 300 ppm. There was 1 week in between applications. The first application was done when trees were looking like that. It was pretty much 50% bloom, which later we thought that it would have been more beneficial if it was a little bit more advanced. And we did it with a battery powdered hand sprayer. So it was just spraying the trees. We had 6 trees per treatment in each of the varieties. And as Kevin was saying, shortly after we did the spray, I think this was a day later, we already could see a lot of petals on the ground. And so some of the measurements we took were the mean number of fruitlets remaining. So we went there and counted 12 shoots per tree in each of those 6 trees, and counted the number of fruitlets that we have. We just got, typically they were like 12 inches or so shoot long, 12 inches shot, 12 inches long shoots, and we counted the number of fruitlets that we have remaining there. And so here what we got was that there was a quite variability between varieties. The Summer Prince was showing a reduction in number of fruitlets for the trees treated with 1 application of 300 ppm. However, for the other varieties, we did not see any difference. Then when thinning time came, we had the help of commercial crews, that they came thinning, and we just measured the time that they were taking per tree. We told them, do not rush it. This is not a competition or anything, just thin as you normally thin. Because when you're there with a chronometer, they kind of think like, oh, they're thinking, am I doing a good job? No. It's like, this is, just do what you do and don't worry about that. And here we found something interesting for the scallop prints, actually. We saw, well, you can see how these, again, big trees, they would take about 30 minutes per tree. But we did not see significant differences in reduction of time. However, for the scallop prints trial, we did see about a couple of minutes. Again, these were smaller trees. So I think between 10 minutes and 8 minutes, 2 minutes and 10 minutes, that count. It's almost like 20%. And so this was something interesting to see how these two applications of ACCEDE resulted in 2 minutes less time for spent in thinning. Here for these experiments, we did collect the fruit at harvest. I'm not showing the data here because we did not see any difference in fruit quality. We were expecting, especially for the scallop print, we were expecting to see a bigger size for the ones that had less fruit, right? But we ended up didn't see, the differences were not, how can I say, like they did not affect the horticultural performance. Let's say, as you know, like growers have certain categories. So even if you could have some differences of a few millimeters, in the end, that does not affect how the peach is, categorized. If it's not a practical difference. No? In 2021, we were planning to do this in the upstate and at the same time in the reach, in the same farms, but there was some cold events that prevented us the possibility of doing the applications. And so in the end, we were, because in the upstate trees bloom later, we were only be able to do it there. And this is part of what Kevin showed of the harvested and early August prints and the effect of the not the sticker, how do you say, like the spreader, and those data come from this orchard. But anyways, let's look into it. We had 2 rows, 1 row of harvester, 1 row of trees of early August prints. Our treatments were 6 trees in each, 6 tree plots. Was each treatment repeated throughout the row, and these were the treatments that we followed. Again, this was based on the recommendations of Kevin. We have different concentrations, different nozzle size, reduced nozzle size, or standard nozzle size, so that we could have different gallons per acre. Now you can see how number 5, for example, had double the amount of regulate, which was the one that we used here. For the experimental one, we used LI 700. I forgot saying it, but and then initially we were asked to do treatments between 1 and 5. We also messed up and do an extra one. We were doing number 4. We actually did it with a standard nozzle size. So. We did it with a reduced nozzle size, but we also did it with a standard nozzle size. So we have an extra treatment that initially we were not planning to do. I call it number 6. In the next slides, it appears as X. So we have this extra treatment that is like the high concentration and high, standard nozzle size. For each tree, we flag 10 shoots, 5 on each side of the tree. Typically, it was 2 on the top, 2 in the middle, medium canopy, and 1 at the bottom. And those were the shoots where later we came back and count the number of fruits, number of flowers and number of fruits. In this case, we did our applications on March 21st. There was a frost event on March 13th. That's why, again, we were not able to do it in the reach. And our applications were between 11 and 2 p.m. We're thinking like it started to become too hot, but it was only 81 Fahrenheit by the end of the experiment by 2 p.m. And again, a few days later, we came back. We started to see how they were already. Oops. Well, anyways, it's the same thing. There were already some blooms that were dead. So when we counted number of flowers, this was about a week after the application. We could see how for harvester we have a reduction in number of flowers only for this X treatment, the one that we applied at the high concentration, at the very high concentration. However, for early August prints, we saw it for treatment number 2, which I can go back, sorry, which was this one at 800 ppm. Later, we counted number of fruits at 2 different times in May and this is not right. This should be June. I'm sorry. This is the 6th. Harvested is typically harvested at the end of June or beginning of July. They're in the upstate. So we did it in May and then in June. Now we have here 2 groups of columns: commercial fruit and total fruit. What does it mean? When we went there to count number of fruits, we were seeing how there were lots of buttons, which we assume it's because of the frost event that happened before, and then the regular, the fruit that we would harvest. So that's this fruit that we would harvest, the good ones. This is what we call commercial fruit in here. But we counted everything. We even counted the little ones. And so when we sum the little ones, the buttons plus the regular size, that's the total fruit. Growers would leave those buttons just to drop. They wouldn't be natural. They wouldn't be thin. They would naturally be thin, but not hand thin. So I think we should focus on the commercial fruit. But again, I just put there all the data. And what was interesting for harvester was that there were 3 treatments that significantly reduced the number of fruits. One was the treatment number 3, treatment number 5, and treatment number 6. And we could see that for, again, well, mostly commercial fruit. We can see it also here for the same treatments. If we go back to the table, that would mean the one at 800 ppm, the one at 600 ppm, but with double the concentration of regulate. And so this is something that was highlighting Kevin. And then the one with the very high concentration in high gallon per acreage. If we look into early August prints, we saw something similar. In this case, wasn't the treatment 3 and 5, was it treatment 2 and treatment 5. So treatment 5 seems to be the one that is consistent, at least with our data. So here, this C and this BC, as you can see. However, for the late, again, this should be a 6, this is in June. For the late harvest, we did not see clear, significant differences. So once again, there were these 2 treatments, the 600 ppm with a standard nozzle size, and treatment 5, the one that had double the rate of regulate. So out of this, well, unfortunately, this grower was selling his land and right immediately after this. So he was not interested in the fruit. Like, he did not harvest this fruit. He did not spray for pests or diseases before that. And so we were not able to measure fruit quality in here because the fruit quality was pretty bad. That's why we only did the fruit counting. And so as conclusion for us, under our conditions, we did not see clear effect at those low concentrations of 300 ppm. It seems that there was a consistent reduction in fruit number with 600 ppm at 100 gallon per acre. That's the treatment 5, or well, also because it had the double the rate of regulate. But again, it's a pity that we don't have data on yield or fruit quality, and I think that's really important to address the whole picture. And I just want to acknowledge Titan Farms and Big Smile for the trials in 2021, Kenny Potitz and Andy for all the efforts in the experiment in 2022, and my team of people that helped me with all the counting of flowers. And any questions or any comments, maybe related to how you blend this with what Kevin mentioned?
Any questions? All right.
Okay.
Just one comment, the reason we lost all the fruit is because the grower had to prune, and then we had that really late frost, and because he had pruned, we had a lot more damage. This was after the ACCEDE application, so it had nothing to do with that. It was just the pruning timing followed by the freeze. So that's why he didn't harvest. It wasn't so much the selling of the land. If he had fruit there, he had enough fruit, he would have harvested it. He took the insurance and called it a year.
Juan Carlos.
In the year you did the testing, was there sufficient chilling?
Yes. Last year was, yeah,
1,400.
was fine.
Touching out there. 45.
And harvested in early August springs are not very,
We were way over anything,
Yeah.
like around right at 1,400.
also here in the upstate, pretty much, and we always get good chilling too. Anything else?
Any more questions? Before I start the last one, if y'all can get that pink piece of paper in front of you and fill out an evaluation. We like to hear the bad stuff and the good stuff, so it'll make this meeting better for next year. Last on the agenda is.
Good afternoon, everybody. First, I want to thank you for inviting me to present about this work that has been done at University of Georgia in 2021. Also, I apologize again for not being in person, and any questions that you may have, I would be more than happy to answer through email. But I'm sure that with the panel discussion, probably a lot of the things will be answered. So the title of my presentation is ACCEDE Experiences in Georgia Peach Production. I am Dario Chavez, an associate professor in peach research and extension at the University of Georgia in the Department of Horticulture. When you think about what we were trying to do is basically we wanted to study the use in peaches, either what is the developmental stage that we wanted to use of flower or fruit, and the concentration that we were looking at. And the objective was basically to develop a chemical cleaning program for crop load management in peach. So as you probably have heard, other crops like apples and cherries and other, they have already chemical cleaning programs which save a lot of money because of the hand paper. When you think about peaches, what we decided to do is 3 different experiments. The first experiment was to test the flower and fruit developmental stages. The second experiment was to test different concentrations and formulations, and what formulations are ACCEDE, each is a different formulation. One was a liquid, and one other one was I believe a soluble powder. And the final experiment was to test ACCEDE under grower conditions. The idea is that see what happens in grower applications and try to get some conclusions based on that. So when you think about testing different flower fruit developmental stages, this is what we were doing. We were looking at the plants when they have about 20% ink. We were looking at plants when they were full bloom and first petal fall. You can see that there's some petal fall already happening. And then we were talking about the developmental stages of early fruit set and between 5 to 10 millimeters diameter. What we decided to use is a cultivar 7-year-old July Prince trees grafted onto Guardian, and these were managed in following the commercial guidelines. So here we have a tree. So what we did as a setup is that we have a randomized complete block design. What it means is basically all the treatments were randomized within a replicate. And a block replicate, the trees will be basically separated and there were bordered trees across the orchard. So we will be able to apply the chemical in individual trees, and we were not collecting data from the trees surrounding it. Now, in each tree, we were tagging 10 shoots, and we were tagging 3 shoots on the upper level of the canopy, 4 shoots in the middle section, and 3 in the bottom part of the canopy. Again, where you can have differences for spraying. And the treatments applied were using a CO2 pressurized sprayer. So we can basically pressurize the tank that will be individually used for a tree. And it was calculated based on the rate per acre. So the treatments that we were doing, as I mentioned before, we have a control that did not receive any spray. Then we have a stage of early bloom, 20%, and it was ACCEDE at 600 ppm, active ingredient, and plus an adjustment that was suggested by Balin. The late bloom is basically first observed herbal fall. The fourth treatment was late bloom application plus early fruit set, and the early fruit set was a follow-up for 300 ppm, and then the only treatment of fruit set basically, and it was 300 ppm. You can see the different dates. One goes from the middle of March, a week later, and about a week later as well. So what we had is these tags throughout the orchard and in different trees. And what we were looking at is counting the flower numbers, basically in that length. And then we were also measuring the length of it, and also getting some counts, basically, which was important. So what we did is we had a prior treatment count. Then we also had a freeze, so we took into account and did a count before and after. Mostly it was just right after because we did have the prior treatment. And then in some occasions, in this case, we didn't do any thinning due to the freeze. And then we had a final count. And then also we followed the trees, had some yield data, and collected some fruit size, weight, and perimeter data as well. So what did we see? So this table is a little bit busy, but what we're having here is the bloom stage, the different treatments as before. You can see that we have the control, early bloom, late bloom, first pedal, late bloom plus early fruit set, and early fruit set. So it goes from no treatment from the earliest to the latest, okay? And the application date, you can see the difference on the application date. The number of shoots that we treated per treatment. And then this is just data that we use for other analysis, but the most important thing here is that you know that we have the shoot length, the flower number, and there are some differences in flower numbers for the different treatments. However, the most important thing is that we were able to calculate a percentage fruit set because we did a count of buds, of flower buds at the beginning of prior treatments. And then we came back actually and did a fruit set count, basically about before we even did the early fruit set, just to see how everything was. And we did that because we had a freeze. So we just were interested in seeing how is the fruit set before the freeze. But then you can see that after the freeze, about basically 2-3 weeks when we will see the damage, you can see that the fruit set actually was reduced. And that point too, we noticed that when we apply or spray also the early fruit set treatment, we dramatically reduce the fruit set in here as well. So another thing that we saw is that when we did the treatments, and it's the same table, basically for the different treatments, it's just looking at yield now. And these are pounds per tree, grams, and fruit perimeter inches. So you can see that the control, you have 93 pounds. Still, you have a very comfortable weight that is 235 grams weight and 3 inches. Again, the freeze did some thinning as well. So the important thing of the take-home thing to take into account is the fruit set that we did prior, basically just after the freeze event. Now you can see that early bloom, you have probably 259 grams. Then you have late bloom and application about 240 grams. But you can see that there is a reduction with a late bloom plus early fruit set treatment, which maybe tells you that it's too much. The effect of the double application is a little bit too much. So what are the notes that we got? The double application, late bloom plus early fruit set, not recommended. Reduced fruit set and yield, I think so it's probably too much, and it had over effect on the plant. Besides that, is that the early fruit set application resulted in visible leaf yellowing and defoliation as well. So you are just starting to produce the carbohydrates that it needs with those little leaves. So you don't want to affect that. And then the early bloom, the 20%, is more likely the more appropriate stage to be able to use the chemical, where we saw some effect, but of course we didn't see any detrimental effect on the plants. Now, in the case of yield and fruit, no thinning was performed due to the freeze in the second week of April, but we did notice that the treatment with the largest average fruit weight and perimeter and comparable yield across treatments was the early bloom. Because the treatment was done early, generally speaking, you can potentially have a bigger fruit size, and I think so we saw that. But there is something to think about it. We didn't see statistical differences. We did have a larger fruit, but we didn't have those statistical differences. For the second experiment, when we test different concentrations and form of formulations of we use the scarlet print tree extracted from Guardian. And in this case, we didn't use the stages, but we focused actually on early and late bloom. We didn't do the early fruit set. So it's basically between 20 to 50% bloom in this case. So we did the same setup in the field, randomized complete flow design, 6 replications per treatment. We tagged the 10 shoots per tree, and we also apply using the CO2 sprayer. In this case, we do an early to mid bloom, like I mentioned before. Now the treatments that we had in here is that a control, and we did decide to do ACCEDE 300 ppm plus regulate. Then we had this formulation that is ACCEDE as well, but it's just a different formulation. I think it's a weathable powder. And then we have ACCEDE and the same formulation, just at 600 ppm, a little bit higher. They were all applied in the same time. The treatments, in this case, you can see that we have the same tags and we collected the flower and fruit counts per shoot. The idea is that prior treatment or prior treatment effect. Again, we have a freeze event to keep in mind. And then we did do thinning in this case. All you are familiar with scarlet prints, and this was located in Fur Valley. The July print was located in Griffin. So we had a harder freezer in Griffin compared with Fur Valley. And in Fur Valley, scarlet prints did seem to have set better fruit set overall. We have a good yield and a fruit size parameters. So what did we see? Again, the same setup of the table. We have the treatments going from control, the ACCEDE, the other formulation, 300 ppm, and then the other two is 600 ppm. The shoot length, flower number, and again, these are not as important, but the ones that we care the most is the fruit set values. So in here, we have the control, basically, it's 2 weeks probably about when we spray. You can see that the control actually have 84% fruit set compared with ACCEDE and the other formulation that were about 63 and 56%. And then the ACCEDE 600 ppm and the BCB 3452 that were in the latter part of the set. So in the case of the after application and where we'll see the effect, you can actually see that there was a comfortable thinning created by the chemical at 600 ppm. And 300 ppm you got some effect, but probably the 600 ppm is the one that got at least 50% of the crop of flowers in there out. Now we did hit the freeze, and you can see that there was actually an effect on the freeze. You can see that the fruit set was reduced. Still, the ACCEDE 600 ppm seemed very comfortable fruit set as well. So although the freeze did affect the experiment overall, you can tell that there is an effect on the amount of flowers of fruit that was left in the tree. So what happens with the yield? Yield was all over the place. Sadly, with the freeze, basically, we didn't see an effect, and sometimes also we had trees that had high yield, some other trees that didn't. Again, a freeze, as it does, is a problem. And this is something to think about too. If you know that you have some varieties that they don't have a high plume density, probably you have to be careful if you are considering using ACCEDE. More likely, I would recommend in varieties that you know that they always set a crop independently if there is a freeze event or something, and they have high bloom density as well. One thing that we did collecting here was the time of thinning time, but still it was all over the place as well. We did have an average, a higher amount of thinning time in the control, and the others were a little bit lower. But again, the freeze did affect our experiment. So the notes. The fruit set data shows the effect of the chemical thinner even after 2 weeks of application, which was very, very nice to do. The treatment with lowest fruit set after application was ACCEDE and B3452 at 600 ppm. And then again, I think so they both are ACCEDE, it's just a different formulation. I'm not sure which one is in the market now. And then we for sure believe that the freeze in the second week of April did affect the overall yield. Now the final experiment and test ACCEDE under grower conditions. What we decided to do is basically try to follow at least the fruit set in grower plots. Baleen approached some of the growers to do some tests prior the product was released, and all of the plots that we used were scarlet green trees, which is comparable. Again, what we did in here was a little bit different. We have larger blocks sprayed, and then we selected basically randomly 6 trees within the block, always try to be in the middle. And then we had on spray blocks next to it. And also, I will show you how it's set up. Then we did tag the 10 shoots equally. And then the spray was done using a plastic sprayer. And again, early to mid bloom. So the treatments, we basically have 3 type of treatments: the control, that was on the spray, the ACCEDE plus regulate, and then again, look at the concentration that we use is 300 ppm in here, and they're dripped. What this consists is that we have a whole block that was treated, and think about the rows here. And then we had some sections untreated, and then in the middle we did basically a row back and forth. And this was basically what we will. These were the untreated, and this was kind of like the drip aspect of it. So we collected some data in this row to see how well it was. So flower counts, again, prior treatments, we did have the freeze again, and the thinning was on the growers. So the results. This is a little bit kind of messy. I was just trying to bring it up. So here we have table 1 is in one farm, Scarlet Green's Saxon farm. So you guys know whose farm is this. Then we have Scarlet Prince in Estes Farm, and then we have Scarlet Prince in Saxon Farm as well. And this is thinning time. So in the first table, we have similar to the other experiments where we have a fruit set, and the same thing in Estes Farm, a fruit set, and then we have a thinning time. So this fruit set is basically prior to the freeze event. So we just basically decided to focus on the prior freeze event, and about 2 weeks after application, where you normally would see the effect. And you can see that overall, we didn't see an effect, differences per se between the treatments. You can see that there is pretty equivalent. However, the grower collaborator did collected some timing for thinning, and in the data that he collected, there was difference for thinning time. So although we didn't see the difference on fruit set at the time, when he did the thinning time at this date, the 27th, about 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, there was a difference on the thinning time, and it was significant difference. So the note is no effect observed with rates used across the block, possible issue as well with the freeze event. However, there was a thinning time reduction with the use of ACCEDE, which is very beneficial for the grower because it meant that he was reducing the amount of time that the labor were spending on the tree. So if you have any questions, we'll be happy to help. I know that probably the speakers that are present in this panel would be more than happy to answer those questions as well, as they have been testing this product. But please let me know if I can help with anything. I think this is a very exciting time because we will have this as a tool that could help in certain occasions and varieties. As I mentioned before, you have to select which ones you will be more likely using just because of the constant freezing events that we have. And with this, thank you so much.